Good evening, folks. I'm Jagdish Krishnaswamy. I'm with the School of Environment and Sustainability at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. This evening's event is jointly organized by Indian Institute for Human Settlements and Dakshin Foundation. It's my absolute pleasure and privilege to introduce Kartik Shanker as the speaker for today. So Kartik became interested in ecology and natural history like many others in the city where he grew up, which is Chennai, and a creature which is many million years old and is still with us was an inspiration, the olive ridley turtle. And Kartik has done his doctoral degree at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, just in our neighborhood. He's done amazing things. He works on how biodiversity is structured, all the way from genes to entire ecological communities. And he's applied this to lots of different organisms, frogs, fish, birds, and of course turtles. And he did his doctoral research in the Western Ghats in the Upper Nilgiris. But then, amazingly, he's done all this stuff in our oceans and seas. He's also the one of the founding founders of Dakshin Foundation, which is co-organizing this event with us this evening. And he has also been the director of the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Environment. And you folks are in for an absolute treat. So over to Kartik.
Thanks, Jagdish. It's a pleasure to be here at IIHS and to be introduced by Dr. Jagdish Krishnaswamy. Firstly, for that very generous introduction, but also it's also particularly special to be introduced by someone you've known for 25 years, which gives our antiquity away a little bit. All right. So I'm going to be talking to you today about some of the turtles that we've been tracking over the years. But really, this is sort of a broader story of not just sea turtle conservation, but not just sea turtle conservation, but marine conservation in general in India. And perhaps we're going to zoom out even a little bit further to conservation in general. All right. So sea turtles have sort of fascinated humans for millennia, and I don't use that term lightly. You can actually find turtle artifacts, use of turtles, turtle bones, in historical archaeological sites dating back to thousands of years. You can find them on medallions. There was trade with between the Roman Empire and southern India and Sri Lanka or Ceylon or Taprobane as it was then known, even during the Roman Empire. The first known the first known sea turtle conservation law was actually passed by the Bermuda Assembly in 1620, where they were deeply concerned about people slaughtering their young tortoises and resulting in their decline. And it's quite interesting. This goes on to say that anybody caught, killing what they call so excellent a fish would be fined by having to pay a certain amount of tobacco, I think, which was the currency of the day. Anyway, zooming forward, we're talking here about 7 species of sea turtles, 5 of which, the first 5, leatherbacks, greens, loggerheads, hawksbills, and ridleys, are found all over the world, including in India, and the other 2 are sort of like localized to Australia and Mexico. These are widely distributed species. There's just 5 of them, and they attract an inordinate amount of attention. The annual Sea Turtle Symposium, which is this annual conference of biologists and conservationists, attracts between 500 and 1,000 people each year. So per capita, per species, it might actually be the most, the most sought after conservation icon in the world. Now, why is that? Again, as I say, human sort of fascination with sea turtles goes back thousands of years, but in the last 100, 150 years, naturalists, the general public, and more recently, in the last few decades, scientists have really been obsessed with these animals, ranging from leatherback turtles that are the largest, grow to several, 6 or 7 feet in length, weigh over 500 kilograms, are amongst the deepest diving air-breathing vertebrates, diving to more than 1,000 meters. Hawksbill turtles that have this extraordinary diet of sponges, which, if you're familiar with what sponges are made of, is like eating glass. Green turtles, herbivores, again, globally distributed, sought after for their meat for hundreds of years. And this extraordinary animal, the olive ridley, which nests in these phenomenal aggregations of over hundreds of thousands of turtles at a time. Now, the other reason that turtles have been fascinating, for everybody from kids to adults, is that they do these remarkable things. Amongst which all sea turtles sort of do these large-scale breeding migrations. They move thousands of kilometers from feeding to breeding ground. They mate in offshore waters, nest usually at night on sandy beaches. Now, when the hatchlings incubate for about 7 to 8 weeks or about 2 months, the sex is determined by temperature. So higher temperatures produce females, lower temperatures produce males. When hatchlings emerge, they find the sea using the brighter horizon, so the reflection of moon and starlight on water, and then take many, many years to mature, coming back to the same beaches where they were born to nest as adults, which they locate using the Earth's magnetic field. So from these enormous breeding migrations to the sex being determined by temperature, to the sea-finding ability as hatchlings and using the Earth's magnetic field. There are all of these aspects of their biology that are at the same time enigmatic and mysterious and equally sort of fascinating to researchers. A very quick sort of like recap of sea turtle history in India. Conservation history starts in what used to be popularly known as the Big Italy or Chennai city, which is where I started as well. And we all owe our inspiration to a gentleman called Ram Whitaker, who started the Madras Crocodile Bank and Snake Park and started turtle walks in the early 70s. When we were in college, a group of us came together and formed a students group called the Student Sea Turtle Conservation Network, which has been doing sea turtle conservation there since then up to the present. Now, while conservation started in Chennai, or sort of interest in turtles started in Chennai in the 70s, around the same time, various forest departments started to establish hatcheries. Various other NGOs came up in various states, and you can actually see, on the map over there, there's at least one and sometimes 3 or 4 NGOs in each of India's coastal states. But in the 90s, there was building on interest by other agencies. There was more sort of national level attention to sea turtles, and various projects were carried out that sort of surveyed sea turtles around the coast. And over the decades that followed, there's been monitoring by multiple national agencies, research institutions, and NGOs across these key sites. So that's sort of a very general background to what we know about sea turtles today. And going from here on, I'm going to focus on the 3 main sites that we monitor turtles at and what we've learned or not learned by working there. We're going to start with the leatherback. And I always start with the leatherback story with the person who inspired much of sea turtle work in India, Satish Bhaskar, who died a couple of years ago. Now, Satish was actually an engineering, was doing engineering at IIT Madras. But instead of going to class, he spent his days running to the beach, swimming, and running back. Now, this was pretty much all that he had done until he walked into Snake Park one day, as did many people in Chennai in the 70s. The history of conservation is littered with people who bunked class, went to Snake Park, and one sort of strange-looking white guy walked up to them and said, "Hey, man, do you want to clean out a snake pit?" And that's how many careers started, including Satish's. And Satish then was encouraged by Ram and others to sort of like start doing these sea turtle surveys. And he started out, he did a survey in Tamil Nadu, and then he went to the Andamans. And in 1979, he did a survey in the report. He writes, in the interest of brevity, it will be better to list the areas and islands not surveyed. And we're talking about a group of several hundred islands. And after a very brief listing, which included a few major sites, he says, practically all the other coasts were surveyed there. About 10 years later, 7 or 8 years later, he goes out to West Papua, and as Ram Whitaker writes, he would actually swim out to this longboat to give letters to be sent home. So he would swim out to this passing longboat and tag thousands of turtles by himself, hundreds of turtles, counted more than 10,000 nests, but the numbers dropped dramatically. So 10 years later, when these Americans went there, what they discovered was that the local folks, and there were local Papuans there for whom Satish Bhaskar was the first outsider that they'd ever met. They'd not even met any other Indonesian. This was the first outsider who had ever come to their community. And they were convinced that he tagged these turtles with these metal tags, went back to his country, took a giant magnet and attracted all the turtles back and stole them. So they were convinced that Satish had stolen their turtles. And he was really well known for all of these amazing things. He decided to spend 5 months on an uninhabited island called Suheli in Lakshadweep, because that's during the monsoons. That was when the green turtles nested during the monsoons, and the fishermen didn't visit. And so he said, just drop me off there and pick me up in 4 months' time. And you'd imagine that in 1982, without any cell phones and satellite phones, he would have no contact. But he used to swim out to the reef and throw a bottle into the sea every, for the first few weeks, I think, when he had a little bit of, few rupees to put in the bottle. And eventually one bottle reached the Sri Lankan coast, was posted to his wife. His wife got the letter within a month, which is like pretty decent even by today's postal standards. And the boat that came to pick him up, how we get irritated when Ubers are like 5 minutes late these days, right? Or some train is like half an hour late. Or a flight is, the trains, does anybody take trains anymore? When a flight is like, delayed, we're like, oh my God, I'm stuck at the airport. The boat that was supposed to pick him up was 1 month late. Okay. And he just sat there. He had rations, he had provisions. So he sat there and he ate and he was happy. And he was, when the boat came, he came back. And that's the island which we visited in 2015, about exactly 10 years ago. And it took us actually weeks of planning. And we went out there as a large team of like 4 researchers and 10, not like 6 or 7 fishermen. And it took us months of planning and to just do a 1-week trip over there. So the kind of enterprise that this man had back in the 70s and 80s to do these things and eventually survey the entire coast of India, of Andaman Nicobar, of Lakshadweep, and provide this baseline on which everything else that we've done rests is remarkable and noteworthy. And I think we need to recognize those the shoulders of those giants that we stand on. That, if I didn't mention it before, is a garland of sea kraits, which is one of the most venomous snakes, but they don't bite. And so when he was young and foolhardy, he kind of like, draped himself with all of these sea kraits and had someone take a picture of him just to prove a point. Anyway, based on Satish's work, the Madras Crocodile Bank, gentleman named Harry Andrews, and subsequently afterwards, I was involved in that project. We started monitoring one of the sites that Satish had discovered in Great Nicobar in the early 2000s. But that was destroyed by the tsunami. And that sort of brings me to another quick story. This young man from the Karen community, which was settled in the Andamans in the 1920s by the British, Agu was actually at our camp when the tsunami struck, as was one researcher, several field assistants, some visiting birders from Pune. And as you can see from the previous slide, that's what happened, right? And so the entire place was wrecked by this 20-meter wave, and all of them died. And this man somehow miraculously didn't drown, was washed out to sea, stayed without food and water on a log for 12 or 13 days. Let that sink in. He was on a log without food or water for 12 or 13 days. Eventually managed to swim back to land with lots of broken bones, and was rescued. And 2 years later, a year later, he was back in the field with us. We were going out to survey new sites, and this is the other boatman over there is one of the first Karen boatmen and field staff who worked with people like Satish Bhaskar from the very outset of the 70s and 80s. So this is like sort of the, um, uh, the folks who started, Agu somewhere in the middle, and you'll see the new generation now. And just because of all of these people that we're able to work in these areas and do the work that we currently do. So the long-term monitoring itself that we initiated back in 2000, 2001 of all of these beaches in the Nicobar, sort of many of them showed a dip in the in the 2004, 2005 window immediately after the tsunami because the beaches had gone, but most of those beaches recovered and most of those populations have sort of like fluctuated up and down. But we only get to monitor them once in a while. I mean, once in 4 or 5 years, so we don't have a really good sense of what's happening there. So what we had done after the tsunami is that we set up a camp at West Bay and South Bay in Little Andaman so that we could monitor them on an annual basis. And that's the picture is of that boat trip where Uncle Pao and Agu and we went out and surveyed those beaches for the first time in order to establish the monitoring programs over there. And what that's beginning to show us is when you monitor them, year after year, and this is really crucial, as you can see from the yellow bars, which is West Bay, that there's an overall sort of like there's what appears to be a fluctuation, but what might be an increasing trend. But there is so much fluctuation that depending on the years when you survey them, you might actually see them going up or down and come to erroneous conclusions. In fact, if you selectively pick out a year, you might even see a downward trend over there. So it's really important for us to have been out there every year in order to be able to look at this data and infer that these population, as either stable or increasing. The second thing we were able to do with these leatherbacks, which was pretty cool, is we were able to put satellite transmitters on them and track them all the way west to Mozambique and Madagascar, and westward to Western Australia and Timor-Leste. The myth around these turtles was they came from Australia, so much so that locals in the early 2000s used to tell us, हाँ सर वो सब कचरा ऑस्ट्रेलिया से आता है हमको पता है एक बार देखा था वो लिखा था ऊपर from Australia लिखा था so there was a general sort of the local legend was that they came from Australia. And this is the beautiful thing about science and the irritating thing about turtles. The first 8 turtles that we tagged, most of them went east towards Australia, and we were like, okay, looks like the local, the narratives are true. Maybe they do all come from Australia. And 2 of our transmitters failed, and so we wrote to the company, very nice guy who used to be, worked there, and we said, we're poor Indians, we can't afford more transmitters. 2 transmitters failed. Can you send us 2 new ones? And they rarely do this, but he was like, oh, you know what? Generosity, here's 2 more transmitters. What's better, I'll send you our latest model. And those 2 ones were the ones that actually did the opposite of what almost all the others were doing and went in the opposite direction. So every time somebody tells, or I say, I know, I know, as a biologist, I know something about sea turtles, take it with a pinch of salt. The other cool thing about this is what we've been able to show, as previous studies have, is that the reason that they go out to these distant places is because these are sort of the chlorophyll hotspots, or hotspots of productivity, where they're essentially tracking jellyfish because that's what they eat. And so leatherbacks are found in much colder waters than other turtles. They live in subarctic waters. They can maintain their body temperatures up to 10 to 15 degrees higher than the surrounding water. So they're kind of like almost warm-blooded. They're not cold-blooded like most reptiles are. They actually have provided insights into how dinosaurs may have thermoregulated. Right. So our second story comes from Odisha, where these marvelous ridleys do this, indulge in this extraordinary mass nesting behavior called Arribada. And olive ridleys get the most attention in India. Every time some turtles wash up dead on the coast of Chennai or of Odisha, there's lots of newspaper articles about how, they're on the verge of extinction and blah, blah. Right? And that's actually one of the key things that I want to talk about or, discuss in terms of how does the science we've produced, how has that affected the narrative of either conservation or policy, right? All right. So the mass nesting beaches at Gahirmata and Rishikulia, which are the contemporary ones, are the largest mass nesting sites outside of Pacific Central America. The other big beaches are in Costa Rica and Mexico. A very new mass nesting beach was discovered in the Andamans about 15 years ago, but it's fairly small, about 10 to 20,000 turtles in Arribadas there. This beach itself has been known for a long time. Ship's captain wrote about it in 1727, and it spoke of prodigious numbers of sea tortoises resorting to lay their eggs. And Balasore is very close to Gahirmata, so that area has been known for nearly 300 years now. It was officially discovered by science when a Australian crocodile and turtle biologist, a Scottish crocodile and turtle biologist, came to India on a croc survey and discovered Gahirmata and wrote about it and published a scientific note about it. Chandrasekhar Kar, a researcher with the Forest Department who did his PhD with Bustard, discovered a second site in 1982 that's no longer active, and a third site was discovered, Rishikulia, in the 1990s. Both Chandrasekhar Kar, featured in the previous picture, and Bivash Pandav here did their PhDs and did some of the early research, tagging lots of nesting turtles, tagging mating turtles in the waters for the first time, discovering that these turtles were coming from as far as Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu. The research that I started with in Odisha, which was on the genetics of these turtles, we showed that the olive ridley turtles globally had not originated off the coast of Central America as people originally thought, but really had originated in the Indian Ocean and then colonized the Atlantic and Pacific, which was quite interesting. Satellite telemetry studies that we initiated in the early 2000s and that was subsequently taken forward by the Wildlife Institute of India showed that these turtles are sort of like outside of the breeding season, sort of pretty much spread all over the Bay of Bengal. So this is a little bit of the background of what was known when we started our monitoring program. But before I come to that, in the early 2000s, we also had taken this bunch of data that we had from previous studies and compiled what was the evidence on the sizes of these Arribadas over about a 25-year period. And what we said based on that was that it looked like there was a recent declining trend. That's in the early 2000s. If you look at the impacts on turtles, there were 50 to 80,000 turtles that were being taken for the meat trade in the 70s. That declined because of the Wildlife Act. But there was a huge increase in trawler-related mortality in the 90s. And so in 2003, researchers, scientists at the Wildlife Institute of India, and I wrote a scientific paper where we said that based on many factors, our statistical analysis, failures of Arribadas, decrease in the size of adults, we wrote that we thought that a sharp decline in the population was imminent and urgent conservation attention was required. So we started monitoring it in 2007, based, on this background of knowledge, based on the fact that you need these long-term data sets. Sea turtle biologists in Australia, Hawaii, South Africa, and the Caribbean had started these long-term programs in the 60s. And we said, why isn't there a program in India? And so in 2007, we started, parallel to the one in the Andamans, we started monitoring them in Odisha. And then what you see over a 20-year period is that there are some years where there are smaller Arribadas or there are none. But overall, again, there's an increasing trend. And I would have looked at this figure and said, or I did say in 2023 that it seems to be increasing, but I'm not sure, right? And this is a picture of an Arribada from 2013. However, in 2025, we had the largest Arribada we've ever recorded, which is 500,000 turtles. This is one of the nights when there was 100,000 turtles on the beach. And when we look at our offshore monitoring data, which I'll come back to again, we actually find that in the years when there was no mass nesting in Odisha, the turtles were there in the offshore waters. Don't ask me what they do, but they have not declined. If you use the offshore waters as an index, the turtles are still there. So based on, now the 20 years of monitoring, we know that Arribadas are occurring at multiple sites. They seem to be increasing at Rushikulya. Fisheries-related mortality hasn't increased that we know of. In 2025, we had 3 of these mass nesting events, 2 in Rushikulya. The second one was as large as the largest one we've had previously. It was about 300,000 turtles, 500,000 in the first one. Count the one in Gahirmata. There were 1 million nests in Orissa this year. The population of olive ridleys in Orissa, I'm saying today, I might change my mind in 2 years' time, is definitely appears to be increasing. Which isn't to say there are no threats. We also monitor sex ratios. The sex of sea turtle hatchlings is determined by incubation temperature, and so they have no external morphology. So we have to wait and hope for some hatchlings to die, and those dead hatchlings are then brought to the lab, and their sex is determined there by using sort of like histology techniques on the gonads. And we then use that to predict current and future sex ratios. And you can see that with the current predicted increases in temperature, these populations are going to be heavily feminized in the next 60 to 80 years. A second set of threats comes from microplastics, which some of the students in the lab, master students, have been working on, and basically they're present everywhere. They're present in the eggs, the hatchlings, the adults, and likely to be from fishing gear. So there's climate change, pollution, various effects that we don't know what the impacts of these are going to be. Nevertheless, I want you to hold this thought that the numbers that we thought and we based our conservation ideas on 20 years ago, those numbers have changed dramatically. All right. Now, I want to pause. I spoke about microplastics, but I want to just pause briefly and for a second in this narrative and talk about sharks and rays. And I said, right, you have 1,000 people at an international turtle conference for 5 species. There are hundreds of species of sharks and rays. They're 400 million years old, and it's been estimated that 30 to 40% of them are threatened globally. And they're far more threatened if you look at the absolute numbers than sea turtles are. There's threats of overfishing, pollution, as our own work shows. By the way, so anyone who eats fish, and I will continue to eat fish despite this knowledge, but every fish we've opened up, every shark, every ray, every other kind of fish, every tissue in those fishes, everything has microplastics in it. It's just like they are everywhere. Now, like sea turtles, the thing about sharks and rays is they're also sort of long-lived animals, and therefore it's really important to generate these long-term data sets. And therefore we set up these monitoring stations at fish landing centers at 3 or 4 sites around the country where we're collecting all of this data. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we found microplastics in every single thing we found. And so the main sort of like body of my talk is about sea turtles and sea turtle conservation. But I want to keep in mind that actually we have evidence, and I think there's evidence from terrestrial systems as well, that the groups that are less examined are, if anything, more threatened than the really charismatic species. And that's a theme I intend to sort of return to when I sort of like wind my way around to it. So let's consider this as sort of the background of knowledge that we have, sort of a brief overview of 50 years of research on sea turtles in India, 20 years of our work monitoring leatherbacks and olive ridleys in the Andamans and Orissa respectively. The conservation context that we sort of work in, that's beginning to be globally sort of recognized more through the process of what's called decolonization of conservation, is that conservation itself has been this imperialist project. And this sort of takes 3 shapes. One is of knowledge, the other is of money, and the third is of space. And the space one is the most written about because, the inequity or the exclusion through the establishment of protected areas, people have lost rights, people have lost land, people have lost, their cultures, all of that through the loss of space has been well established. But however, all of this sort of came about Why did this come about? It's because a lot of it was driven by that early 20th century American ideal of conservation as a pristine wilderness, and comes from initially the writings of Henry Thoreau, but then later on, the first generation of so-called conservationists, such as John Moore, who's considered the father of national parks, uh, political leaders like Theodore Roosevelt, who speaks of Yosemite as a temple built by no hand of man, a temple grander than any human architect could possibly build, right? And folks like Aldo Leopold as well, who first coins the term wilderness. And this idea of pristine wilderness is conservation biologists writing that humans are not part of nature has become something of a religion within the conservation community. And therefore, we felt it's important that this religion has a name. And so, my colleague Daniel Brockington, who's a social scientist, and we write a spoof column. But we thought it was important to address this issue. So religion of pristine wildernesses is called Christianity. Now, Christianity was preached and spread. The gospel of Christianity was spread by global conservation organizations, starting with organizations like TNC, the Nature Conservancy, which actually originated with the idea of land purchase. So land purchasing was one of the original goals of when the organization was set up. Subsequently, WWF, founded in the 60s, and then other groups like Conservation International, Wildlife Conservation Society. Now today, if you look at their charters and if you look at their goals, many of them today do speak the language of community conservation and inclusiveness and so on. Go to their websites, you will find that. But all of these were founded on the colonial conservation ideas of space and knowledge and money. And it's very interesting. If you look at the maps of where they work, these are old maps, so don't take them with a pinch of salt. But it's very interesting because you can actually compare these to maps of, what those are. Those are actually the British and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French empires. So it's really quite interesting how the conservation sort of landscape was carved up in a very similar way that colonial powers carved up the world, 200, 300 years ago. Now, all of this, has led to both, support and critique. Many people criticized it as just, the conservation of cuddly animals just being because it brings in money. There's a book that criticized Conservation International. Folks like Ram Guha, Mac Chapin, Mark Dowie, all of them wrote extensively in the early 2000s about, about the sort of colonial nature of conservation itself. But what I want to draw attention to with regard to sea turtles is the idea that these flagship species, studying flagship species or doing conservation of flagship species helps conservation as a whole, right? And the flagship species is supposed to be an ambassador to draw society's attention towards the need to conserve, larger ecosystems or habitats. Tigers, elephants, pandas, turtles, whales, and so on. But I will argue that on one hand, they can be flagships, but they can also be what we call gunboats and others have called battleships. Again, a small digression. Dan Brockington and I felt that this obsession with flagship species needed a lexicon. And so we wrote about it as conservation diseases that people have. You can be obsessed with mammals. We call it mammalloma. You can be obsessed with apes, elephants, and whales. You can be obsessed with bird watching. It's a condition that we call ornithalgia. As you can see, it comes with a twitch. And like myself and many people in my group, you can have elasmobronchitis. And finally, like me, if you know anyone who's obsessed with reptiles, you know that herpetologists cannot just see an animal and leave it. They have to go catch it, even if it's a king cobra or a python or whatever. It's like being a herpetologist means diving into a bush and catching it. We call it herpes. And comes with a set of sub-diseases as well. And this is sort of the diseases of the flagship conservation world, right? One of those diseases, which is an obsession with sea turtles, has led to this 50 years of obsessive sea turtle conservation, which is fine, which is good. People set up hatcheries, people protected adults, people protected hatchlings, offshore waters, beaches, and so on. Today, around the world, green turtles are so abundant that my colleagues who I've known for 20 years, who like 20 years ago were like, would speak reverently of green turtles. I've heard them call them cockroaches. There are people in Latin America who like who say, but they are like cucaracha. There are just that many of them. To the point where later this year, if you're familiar with the IUCN terminology, from endangered, they're going to be listed as least concern, which is the lowest category you can get. And this is the first time in history that an iconic global conservation icon will actually be listed as least concern. And I expect my sea turtle community to go just crazy when they read it and be like, oh my God, this is terrible. But that's what the data says. In India, we've been tracking them in Lakshadweep. And what we find, what's interesting is that they sort of like they fluctuate, and on every island you see the turtles go like sort of like explode, and then they eat out all the seagrass. There's no seagrass left, and then they disappear. But they haven't disappeared. They've just gone to another island where the seagrass is, and perhaps they leave the Lakshadweep Islands and go to go to other parts of the Arabian Sea where there's seagrass and come back eventually. But they're just like this marauding army of herbivores that are actually terrible for ecosystems sometimes. But then for us, they're a conservation icon. So how do we as conservationists deal with this situation that we're now sort of faced with? The problem is even more complicated for the fishers, because for years now, when those numbers bounce up, when they wipe out the seagrass in the lagoon, the habitat for the nurseries for reef fish and also disappears. The bait fish that the fishermen use for catching tuna, those go down. And fishermen can't wait around for the seagrass will come back in a decade. It's fine. They have to go out and fish each season. So there's been huge conflicts with their sense that the turtles are actually like wiping out their livelihoods. And why did these numbers explode around the world? And here, partly because of conservation. In India, specifically because the turtle nesting beaches in Sri Lanka were protected from the 90s. But secondly, because it could be because those sharks that I just talked about a moment ago, the larger sharks have been wiped out. So potentially, and I speculate, like, all of sea turtle biology is a little bit of hand waving, but there's a lot of hand waving. We're speculating that the knockdown effect of this group that we're really not giving enough attention to is that sea turtles have now exploded, which made conservationists very happy to begin with, but actually it's creating problems for both humans as well as for those ecosystems. This is even more sort of like stark in Odisha. I'll sort of speed this along a little bit. There was decades of use of eggs, and as I mentioned at one point, there was tens of thousands of turtles being shipped each year to Calcutta to be eaten by everybody. As you know, Bengalis believe that fish are fruit of the sea, so it's fair game. The other place where they thought that turtles were fish is in Mexico, and so during Lent each year, when they weren't allowed to eat meat, when the Catholics weren't allowed to eat meat, they'd eat turtles instead because turtles are fish. So a friend of mine, a turtle biologist who sadly passed away last year, wrote a letter to the Pope requesting very kindly that since the the Vatican had very recently agreed that the teachings of Galileo were not, that the church was wrong to persecute Galileo, and the teachings of the Vatican were not in conflict with Darwin's theory. He said, could you do one more thing? Could you decree that turtles are reptiles and not fish? And he got a letter back also saying the matter has been referred to a committee. I'm just making that up. So one of India's first women herpetologists, Vijaya, the forest, she has a freshwater, a turtle named after her, forest cane turtle named after her. Because she rediscovered it in the 80s, she did a field survey and took those pictures that I just showed, which were published in India Today. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi famously saw the pictures and sent a note to her Environment Secretary saying, who's keeping an eagle's eye on the turtle conservation issue, and that's how enforcement and state involvement in turtle conservation started. This was all up to the 80s, but in the 90s, a different problem, which I've mentioned, arose, which was incidental catch, and this was harder to patrol because this was out at sea. And what happened over the course of many, many years is that people started sort of like blaming the trawler owners for all of the problems besetting turtles. And the trawler owners, like anyone accused of murder, said, we didn't do it. They said, no, we're not responsible for this tens of thousands of turtles washing up dead on the beach. Must be because of pollution. Mildly plausible. They said, oh, it must be because of migration fatigue. All these turtles that have been migrating for millions of years are now getting tired and die. But then they also said, my favorite one is they said it's because of labor pain. And one trawler owner actually held my hand and said, sir, I was with my wife when she gave birth to one baby. So much pain women undergo. They lay hundreds of eggs. Imagine. And tears come out of their eyes, which is, of course, them secreting salt. But anyway, very good narrative. But really what they were trying to say, the political point they were trying to make is this is why are only we being targeted when there's all this industry, when there's, ports being built, there's offshore oil exploration. Why are you only getting after us? Surely there are people that are even wealthier than we are. It's only partly justifiable because the trawlers are actually owned by very wealthy people. But this anger of the forest department, this resulted in the anger of the forest department and conservationists, and eventually sort of ended up driving a wedge between all fishers and conservationists, fishers seeing conservationists as anti-fishers, inhuman, and so on. I should also comment that this sort of trawler narrative was pervasive even in other parts of the world. It wasn't just Odisha. People in Australia and the US were saying similar things. What the government did was that based on the offshore studies that had been done at the time, in the early 2000s, they said that the turtles are found in these offshore waters or where they nest. We're going to demarcate these fishing zones over there and prevent people from fishing there. They didn't take into account whether these patches move in time and space. And what we find in the 20 years of our monitoring is actually, this is sort of like different months, different years, is actually off the coast of Rishikulya. The patches are of different sizes, they're in different locations. And so having this one static area where the forest department has said there's no fishing over here is A, minimally effective, and B, unnecessary, because the no fishing area is 400 square kilometers. Where the turtles are is 50 square kilometers. There's this huge area that's being sort of like, that's inaccessible to fishers and creating unhappiness without actually being needed for protecting turtles. The other thing I want you to remember is that those laws were put in place at a time when we thought turtles were declining. But now we know in the last 20 years that there's 1 million nests a year in Rishikulya. So where's our alignment between what we do and what is needed to save turtles? The consequences of that philosophy have been non-trivial. There was in the protests, people died, like including trawlers owners, fishermen, forest guards, and all of this was because they were trying to implement a law in a top-down way, and perhaps in a way that wasn't even necessary, given that the existing fisheries laws would have sufficed. If they had implemented the laws to protect fishermen rather than turtles, they would have actually had the support of fishers as well as protected the turtles incidentally. But the way that we went about it actually created this conflict, and at once, in one sense, was not even necessary. So I'm going to come to my final bit. How do we balance human well-being and environmental health in this world? One of the frameworks that we've built out at Dakshin is the idea that whatever we do, we're looking at the end simultaneously at healthy communities and healthy ecosystems, right? We want both. Now, in order for us to achieve both, there are multiple pathways that we can choose. And the one that we've struggled with actually is what we call the ethical pathway. When we do things that might help the community but don't have a knock-on effect for healthy ecosystems, donors often say, why are you doing that? You're an environmental organization. can you tell me how this helping the community with X or Y will eventually lead to some environmental outcome? And we very explicitly said there is a pathway there that might not have a clear link to healthy ecosystems, but it is still something that in our theory of change exists as a valuable intervention. It and you can make up your mind about what that ethics is. For us, it might just be that I worked with these communities for 20 years, I owe them something, right? Or it could be a more general principle of, I believe in human rights. But you can have ethical interventions that don't necessarily lead to healthy ecosystems. But the other pathways that healthy communities are more empowered, have perhaps more time and resources for conservation, lead to more better governance models. We often have in the shorter term quid pro quo relationships with communities, which is like, because I'm able to do this for you, that's in terms of your education or whatever it is. What I want from your time is, on the, towards conservation of the environment. The pragmatic and organic pathways are the more common ones that are used to connect community interventions to health ecosystems. And they're useful because for most organizations that still want that goal and are not particularly concerned about that goal, those still offer pathways for them to route their journey to health ecosystems through communities. And of course, there's feedback processes. Health ecosystems also lead to have multiple benefits for communities, all of which are sort of linked through a complex set of socio-ecological systems that we then, need to parallelly also monitor and track and adaptively manage. The framework that we've used is called Sea Change, which is sort of combining governance and collective action to ensure both sustainable use of resources and economic well-being, which is culturally aligned and at the moment sort of goes across these sectors, at least in the Dakshin, but it could include others as well. Health, education, governance, livelihoods, things like sports that feed into some of these as well. Now, we think there's a way forward, but we think it needs a change in thinking, right? Now, when I say I love turtles, most people would imagine that I either love, watching them, doing research on them, visiting a turtle nesting beach, collecting turtle curios. That's what people think I mean, right? That pretty much sums up what, if I'm standing in a social group and I say I love turtles, that's, maybe I love a turtle t-shirt, I don't know. But that's about the limit of it. Now, if I were to say I love fish, especially if you were from, Kerala or West Bengal, if I were from West Bengal, Kerala, what would be the first thing that would come to your mind? Right? It would be like, guy likes fish fry or fish curry, right? And it would be a fair assessment, I do. So the point that we'd like to make is that fish are really pluralistic, because the moment I say fish, I love fish, you might think I'm a coral reef biologist and I love going scuba diving. Or you might think I like fishing or that I like fish fry. Fish that way are a marvelous model. You could mean that I love fish because they're beautiful, they taste good, have amazing diversity, make great research models, their behavior is fascinating. We need them for coral reefs, for coastal populations. They have important medical compounds. They make great fridge magnets. I don't know. But it's true. You can try this exercise at home. You use the phrase, I love fish and I love anything else. I love tigers, I love pandas, nobody's going to think you like eating panda kebabs, right? But why not? Why is it that we're so broad-minded and pluralistic and, sort of encompass the whole of human culture when we come to fish, and all of a sudden when we think of anything else, we just sort of become this little narrow sort of descended from Henry Thoreau and John Moore kind of people. Archie Carr, who was sort of descended from that ilk and was the father of sea turtle conservation, did the first campaigns for stopping sea turtle consumption. But he also says, giving it up was my greatest sacrifice to the religion of sea turtle preservation, and I've almost completely given it up. He used to confiscate cans of turtle meat from the supermarkets and eat it quietly in his hut. But his descendants, his proteges and people his students, the people who in my generation are my mentors and people who've retired. They became so hard, they've basically made this a religion, and nobody in the current generation would consider that it's okay to go back to eating turtles, for example. I think Archie Carr would have. So with that in mind, I think, I want to finish on this note of this motto that or this campaign that Dakshin has. This actually came from one of our young researchers back about 10 years ago, and sitting around and having a discussion. And he said, why should we talk about conservation at all? Why don't we just tell the fishermen, khane ke liye bachao? And we thought that was a really good way to frame the conservation argument. We would like to sort of like emphasize that khana does not always need to be literal. It can be metaphorical, but it can also be literal. And in a way that we need to start thinking about conservation not as the preservation of individual species, but as sort of preservation of ecosystems tightly linked to human well-being. And if we can think about it broadly enough, culturally and philosophically and ecologically, then we might eventually be able to achieve this rather sort of ambitious goal, of this enterprise that we all seem to be involved in. Just a couple of like quick things. This is stuff that the team produces, specifically with regard to sea turtles. We have a website, so if you're really interested, go out and take a look at it. If you want to subscribe to our newsletter, the spirit of Khane Ke Liye Bachao, our newsletter about sharks and turtles and whales and dolphins is called Not Just Soup. And finally, I want to sort of thank like a whole sort of like legion of researchers that have been working at multiple sites across the country over the last 15 years, but particularly the three that led the team. Murali, who led the work in Odisha, Chandana and Adit in the Andamans, and many of the researchers, some of whom are all scattered around some one corner of the room over here. You know who you are. That's it. Thank you.
We can have questions from both the online audience as well as the folks here. Okay, so there's one question from Anushka. Does global warming affect the gender balance of turtle populations since the sex depends on temperature? Would this lead to long-term complications for breeding and/or an effect on population numbers?
The short answer is yes. I think I showed one figure where we predict that with the current estimates of temperature increase, given under different scenarios of climate change, the population in Odisha will be largely feminized with over 80% female hatchling production in 60 to 80 years. As in many facets of life, perhaps it's better to be female biased than male biased, because they're really you can have smaller proportions of males, but if it's highly female biased, the pool of genes that's coming from males becomes really small, and that eventually can have consequences for the genetic health and therefore for the population health.
Yeah. So the next question is from Christopher. Do you teach your students to appreciate turtles before they consider conserving them? And then, it's a follow-up thing, appreciating their roles in the ecosystem, etc.
Yes. It's not hard to appreciate turtles. But so I did talk about Archie Carr at the end of at the end of the talk. And even though he talks about giving up turtle consumption and all of that, the rite of passage for a new PhD student that was joining him in Tortuguero in Costa Rica was that they had to eat a raw turtle egg, right? And this was, he said, this is the first thing to becoming a sea turtle biologist. So yes, of course, we absolutely, I think we must appreciate everything and the roles that they play. I think I have a harder time convincing people that turtles are not that special. They're special to me, but they're if we're looking at it more broadly from the view of ecosystem conservation, I think some of the things that the stories that we make up about our heroes, right? Whether it's tigers or elephants or turtles, our heroes have feet of clay. you remove them from ecosystems, nothing bad happens. Uh, you know, most ecosystems are built in with redundant resilience to loss of individual species. And maybe some species are really keystones, but I don't know if any of these large charismatic species are, to be honest.
Amukta asks on the side, one slide said Mr. Ridley. Shouldn't it be Mrs.?
Hey, I'm just going off the film, so Matt Damon was the amazing Mr. Ripley, the talented Mr. Ripley. Yes.
So we can now switch to the audience here.
Sir, it's one nice presentation. And just one question, Jack. Why these sea turtles choose Odisha? Why not others? Like, is there any favorable condition in the Odisha or like any other condition?
No. So ridleys do like nesting near river mouths, and it's sort of like this is my speculation that I've written about, that because there's so many eggs that are laid during an Arribada, the beaches, lots of them don't hatch. Turtles dig each other's nests up. Some are eroded. There's a huge amount of decomposition, and because of that, there's like massive organic and microbial load. And so beaches that are near river mouths tend to get washed away more often, and then new beaches may be created. So I think there's a bit of evolutionary selection, but that doesn't explain everything. And we've actually done analysis which shows that that other beaches are potentially equally as very similar to these. But what does happen over a period of time is that you have to remember that that most of the recruitment of a ridley population is coming from those Arribadas. Most of those are trying to go back to their natal beaches. So actually that cycle of being the most successful producer of hatchlings, and most of those trying to go back there, is going to concentrate those over time, even if that original even if the original choice was slightly accidental. So that seems to be what happens, and eventually they collapse and new beaches form elsewhere.
Yeah, so what I think is like, I think Odisha.
I'll answer more questions in the lab. Okay. So
folks, when you ask a question, just introduce yourself. Just say your name. So while we are waiting, I want to ask a question. There are, in terms of sharing space with the animals, birds, whatever, there are certain limits to, in some sense, biological or ecophysiological limits to sharing space. So I'm just giving an example. If you have gharials, another reptile, they need to bask, and they need to bask for a sufficient amount of time. And if beyond a point they're not able to do that in shared spaces, it probably could be a problem. So that's one aspect of it, and others have argued about temporal separation, where the same space can be used at different times of the day, night, etc., and so on. So there are certain limits to sharing space, and in some sense, sustainability is also about finding those limits also, and ensuring that, this is that the burden of respecting those limits doesn't fall, on certain communities or certain people, right? And so, what are your thoughts on that? Because there are some certain limits to coexistence that we need to look at it from the biological, ecological constraints that these species may have.
no, you're absolutely right, and I think you sort of partly answered that yourself when you said that the burden of ensuring that space is provided doesn't fall on the already marginalized. The critiques of conservation are not that certain kinds of forested habitat, certain kinds of coastal areas with sandy beaches and reefs. It's not that they're not required; they are. I mean, the planet needs them. Now, how do we ensure that that preserve those ecosystems and the services that they provide without disproportionate tax being paid by one particular section of the community. So the critique is of the fact that it's always, that burden is always on a particular part, on one part of the community. The second critique is of and I'll say this as a person who's a dyed-in-the-wool scientist. I believe that I do believe that science has sort of the best framework for us today to understand the world around us. But there are things that we sell as science, which I think, and I said many times today, I am hand waving. I don't know for sure, but people say, oh, all right, if we don't set aside this place as a protected area, turtles will go extinct, right? You didn't know that. Both in Costa Rica and in India, the really interesting thing is that there are two nesting beaches, two mass nesting beaches. One is inside a sanctuary and like a very highly protected area, a national park in both places. Gahir Mata in India, Playa Nansite in Costa Rica. And then there's another one. The one in Costa Rica, in fact, at the unprotected one, the community takes the eggs. So they take the eggs from the first few days of the Arribada because anyway the later turtles will come and dig them up. So there's sustainable use of eggs at that beach. Now, this is a coincidence, but in both places where there are humans, actually the turtle populations have gone up. In both of the protected areas, the populations have kind of like declined or crashed, right? And I'm not saying it's because they were not protected, but I'm just saying this narrative that they can only survive when there was a national park set up turns out to be completely false 30 years later. So I think we need to be careful about the narratives that we're selling as rooted in science. And I think conservation biology is one of those disciplines that has these narratives over the last several decades that conservation biologists have said, can't save the world unless you separate humans and people. Can't do this unless, and then sold it to us as science. And so those are the things that we need to be able to question. But I'm not at all saying that a certain amount of space has to be ceded. I mean, that is inevitable, yes.
Folks?
So you spoke earlier about the colonization, the mindset when it came to conservation, and also about the role of communities, how in Dakshin Foundation, the work that you do, you look at various things that you can do. So I'm just wondering, in your work with these communities, have you also found that there is some wisdom or there is some learning that we can gain by listening to the, what the local communities have to say, and can that inform our conservation efforts?
Yeah, tons. I mean, and I think there's a large sort of body of knowledge. I mean, a body of work today on local ecological knowledge, and a lot of the critique of conservation that emerged from the social science world and what is now sort of like people call political ecology is a lot of that emphasized this one-way traffic of knowledge as well, of us civilizing the natives, telling them that they have to conserve in order for in order for them to sort of benefit as well. And I think increasingly that I'm not sure how many organizations do it, and I'm not sure how widespread it is, but the narrative now exists that local ecological knowledge is important for conservation. And we certainly have found that in numerous instances in many of the places, especially in the Andamans where we work. We wouldn't have been able to do any of the work there without the knowledge of the community that we were, the Karen community, and also the settlers from Jharkhand, locally known as the Ranchi community. Our entire work at the Andaman Nicobar environmental team is built off, their knowledge of nature. Yeah.
So I'm just getting back to the online folks. There are two questions I go to club. One is from Rajesh on how effective are turtle exclusion devices on fishing boats, and then another from Rajshekhar. Why are turtle excluders, why are they not widely promoted in India by the trawlers and by mechanized boats?
So I'm going to start backwards and say that clearly they aren't needed because if the turtles have increased, why are we still talking about it? The question we should be asking is, why aren't we eating those 10,000 turtles instead of letting them wash up and rot on the beach, right? That's the sensible question here. Now, if 20 years ago, around the world, people told, not just in India, I mean, like indigenous communities around the world, laws were passed to prevent them from their traditional consumption of turtle meat because scientists said the populations are declining. Now, if you used science to come to the conclusion that turtles must be conserved, what is the science telling you now? And if those numbers are increasing, shouldn't you reverse your policy? Nobody's doing that. And this is why, this is a question that I want to ask, ask journalists, conservation groups around the country. I'm like, look at the data now. And let's revise our conservation strategy based on what the data is telling us. Otherwise, don't use data at all. Don't use science. Say, I want to conserve turtles because they're lovely and they're my religion, and I will conserve turtles at all costs. It's fine. I accept it. I'm happy to accept that you have this view, I'll have mine. But if you're going to rely on data, let's rely on data all the time. You can't use data when it's convenient and then throw it out later. Now, turtle excluded devices are a red herring, and they're impossible to, and they're not needed. The fisheries laws already say that trawlers have to fish far out beyond 5 kilometers, and that's not where the turtles are. It's just it's this like little, is this bauble that somehow, this shiny thing that keeps, attracting people's attention for some reason. I've written about it, so I won't dwell on it further.
So now from consumption, we'll get back to conservation. So the next
Same thing.
So the next question is iconic nesting sites are always in the limelight. This from Arasu. What about the nesting that takes place in lesser known sites? How to pay attention to such sites for conservation of sea turtles?
That really is a very good question. And the thing is that actually there are, thanks to the turtle walks that started in the 70s and subsequent sort of by diffusion, this idea of monitoring and conserving turtle beaches has spread along the coast. So there are actually NGOs almost in every state, small NGOs that look at just a few villages, others that look at a wider scale. There actually is attention to many turtle nesting beaches in India. Whether one can prevent large-scale ports and development there is a question, but there are small groups working there, and sort of part of a larger network called the Turtle Action Group, and there's information about that on our website.
Okay, so here's this is something that I think is in a lot of people's mind. This is from Asha. If the Great Nicobar Port project comes, what happens to the nesting sites of the giant leatherback turtles?
Can I plead the fifth? Said, can I plead the fifth? Anything that I say. So here's the thing. We can have long debates about the Great Nicobar Port project and its costs and benefits. But again, now there's a nesting beach there that possibly will undergo erosion when there's large-scale development projects, especially ports and harbors. You see erosion at adjacent beaches, and that beach may temporarily or permanently disappear. I have no idea. There are, however, nesting beaches on the west coast, and we've recently had some instances of tagged leatherbacks from our beach nesting in Sumatra, and so we know that these turtles are all using multiple nesting beaches in that region. So is one single port going to affect an entire population of leatherback turtles in some adverse way in even the medium term over the scale of, say, years or decades? A single port, no, right? However, I'm not commenting on the larger issue of whether, what costs and benefits that port brings.
Okay, so here are a couple of messages of appreciation. Amukta, thank you for the wonderful illustrations and graphics. And Swayam Prabha, it's amazing listening to you, Dr. Kartik Shanker. I remember our conservation conversations at Rishikelia. How has conservation of marine turtles helped conserve associated ecosystems and address climate change impact and support community fishery? That's a big one, but
a little bit. I mean, that is kind of my entire point, which is that when every conservationist needs to ask themselves, how is this focus that I have on this flagship? How is it helping anything else? at the end of the day, am I just obsessed with and just focused on the species, and am I not really helping anything else in a broader sense? We have to ask ourselves that. And for me personally, I feel like it's because of turtles that I thought about fishing communities, and because of fishing communities that we thought about, working on health, and all of this. Like, there was a starting point somewhere, but I think it's the broader question we need to.
I think the next question from Arasu, I think you have already covered that. Cite examples of how the local communities are engaged in conservation of turtles. I think you sort of, it's the whole overall narrative. But Sindhu is asking whether turtles are able to delay laying fertilized eggs if they sense that the environment is not conducive.
We don't know. The Arribadas are a particular case where they turn up in offshore waters, and then if they don't nest, we actually really do wonder what they do. If they haven't put the shell around the egg, they possibly can resorb them. But once they shell, if they don't nest, we don't actually. I don't believe they can retain them. They can retain them on the scale of like days and maybe a couple of weeks, but beyond that, they possibly just dump them. I don't know, actually.
So, Srinidhi from CAS in marine biology, my question is, what kind of research gaps do we have regarding the lost years of turtles' life cycles? And why is that? How do we focus on that? And how would it be beneficial for conservation? Could we rear sea turtles and release them in the wild in the future?
So the lost years that she's referring to is basically for many years, for decades, sea turtle biologists didn't know where hatchlings went between when they disappeared into the ocean and then came back as adults. So it was, in fact, it was called the lost year for a long time, and then they realized that this was actually like a decade or two. And so once they sort of dragged out, they live in these seaweed rafts. And then, when they get to a certain size, some species may come and live in these reefs and seagrass habitats and so on. The challenge with this has been tracking them. More recently, there's been more smaller and smaller transmitters that people have been developing. So in the US, they've been putting like really tiny transmitters in these juvenile loggerhead and green turtles, and sort of beginning to get an understanding of what they're doing during these lost years. We haven't had the money to do that yet, or the resources,
So, anonymous attendee wants to know, how does the sea change framework practically balance trade-offs between ecological goals like species conservation and improving socioeconomic well-being for coastal communities?
That's actually a really a good question, and a very tough one to answer. And I think that one has to address these really on a partly on a case-by-case basis, but also by looking at sort of medium-term change. And the metrics to measure some of these are really hard, especially both social and ecological metrics. So the ones that we're trying to get away from are those rather simplistic ones, which I think obscure more than they show. I'm actually going to say that that's something that's really a work in progress. So we're trying to develop. We're actually trying to develop nuanced metrics that can allow us to track success or track progress along both social and ecological sort of axes. But it's not simple at all. And there will be trade-offs. There will be certain things that you want that ideally that a community may want but you can't do, or certain things that ecologically you may want but you can't do. So I think that's something that's a negotiation. But the thing about the negotiation is it has to be inclusive and democratic. It can't be a negotiation that you or I or or people in power politically or in terms of knowledge make the decisions about. That negotiation itself has to be inclusive, and that would be my would be my take home, is that we're going to have to negotiate it, but who's at the table?
Okay, I think, now, Suchit, we talk about conserving a certain species of animals like sea turtles, but when it comes to fishes, we talk about fisheries are affected due to increase in demand, and their livelihood is affected over the changing practices, but never about conserving the fishes and its various species. And then, of course, in parentheses, they they do not breed to be only eaten by humans, right?
Different people have different views of that. But so again, I'd go. I actually think we believe, and we know people disagree, that it. And my point at the end was that it's more productive to look at turtles from the way we've looked at fish in terms of their relation to humans, because after all, humans are the ones making decisions about their conservation. So in what ways are they valuable to us? I'm not saying that we ought to go out there and eat those 10,000 turtles, but are they valuable to us and to the people that have to engage with them in some manner? Why we need to spin conservation around to be about human environment relationships. So in fact, I think that there's value to be taken from the conservation project, but also value to be taken from the fisheries project, and see where the two meet, and not ask the question, why don't we think of fish the way we think of turtles, or only the question of why don't we think of turtles the way we think of fish. Can we think of all of them in some sort of unified framework?
Okay. Here's a specific question from Shamala. Where do the turtles that land in Chennai and Odisha come from?
All over the Bay of Bengal. Many of them are feeding off the coast of Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka, but from the satellite map that I showed somewhere in the presentation, they seem to forage in the deeper waters of the Bay of Bengal, and along the southern Indian and Sri Lankan coast. That seems it for the most part, but we've had some accidental. There's been some one tag that a colleague who's at ZSI found that was from the Philippines, and they. So there's some turtles that are probably going further out. We don't know.
People,
Huh?
people also go.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So
Divija, how do you navigate what the media has to say about turtles declining versus what your research actually shows?
thanks for asking that question. I think one of the things that I actually wanted to say was that, one of I think one of the themes of today's discussion and talk was going to be how does science inform conservation, and I think one of the biggest failures of the last 25 years of my engagement with sea turtles has been changing the narrative, in the media, and changing the narrative in the amongst the wider public. Even when I meet my family, they'll be like, "What a turtle kaisa hai?" As if like it's some like dying relative, and they really think of turtles as my whatever, my family, and they're like, "How are the turtles doing?" Uh, and media is the same. This year, for example, in January, there was like endless numbers of articles in Chennai, and about how many turtles were dying on the coast. And I told the journalists, I told the conservationists, I told the forest department, I think it's because there's more turtles in the water. And by February, they had the highest nesting they've ever recorded in the last, I guess 30, 40 years now. Same in Orissa. Everybody sort of like, in January, they're upset about dead turtles. In March, they're celebrating about Arribadas. And the next year, they've forgotten everything that happened. So I don't know how to change them. I mean, I'm struggling with this. How do we sort of like, how do we get the science that we do to reflect in the larger public sort of perception?
Yeah, it reminds me of when there were turtles being reported recently, for months back in Chennai off the coast.
That's what I'm talking about. Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm going to Hassan's question. What will the post impact of sea level rise on the population size, and will there be any beaches left for nesting?
Oh, there's beaches left for nesting because of development, I guess. I don't know. Well, that is a concern. I mean, I've often said that, like, whether it's tigers or turtles, animals that do, many animals do breed quite rapidly, and ridleys in particular, or greens as well, have in a matter of a few decades come back to really large numbers. But they can if they have habitats. So in some sense, even though the sight of a dead turtle or a dead tiger triggers much more emotion, actually the loss of a beach or a forest is actually much more impactful in the long run. And so in some sense, conservation strategies need to be built around, I'm not saying they need to be pristine or humanless, but around, secure habitats for those species.
So, folks, there are more questions, but I think in the interest of time, we need to wrap this up. So thanks, folks, for being interested, and I'm sure you'll find a way to contact Kartik or folks in Dakshin for with your questions. It's a fairly well-connected world. I'm sure you'll be able to find them. So let's give Kartik a big hand.